When Ethan Blackwood, a 36-year-old mafia boss with an underground empire worth $200 million, stepped out of a secret meeting at an Upper East Side penthouse on a snowy December night, the last thing he expected was to see his own mother, Margaret Blackwood, 74 years old, huddled on the freezing sidewalk, leaning against a young woman so thin she looked like a skeleton, her clothes torn, her whole body worn down to something heartbreakingly fragile. The cold, 15 degrees below zero, cut into the skin like thousands of invisible blades. The blizzard howled through the lavish streets of Manhattan, and there she was, the woman who had raised him in a mansion guarded by security and tended by servants, the widow of one of New York's most powerful bosses, shivering while a homeless girl no one even knew took the only filthy blanket she owned and laid it over Margaret's shoulders, then used her own bony frame as a shield against the brutal wind. Ethan felt the world stop the moment he ran toward them, his heart pounding hard. Fear, a feeling he thought he'd forgotten long ago, tightening around his throat. He couldn't understand why his mother was here, why she was alone in the middle of a blizzard, who the ragged girl was, but what he was about to uncover in this stormy night wouldn't just completely change the way he saw that torn, destitute girl. It would also force him, a man who had ordered killings without hesitation, a man the whole of New York feared, to face the humanity he believed he'd buried for a very long time, to face the truth about what truly matters when all power and money become meaningless. If this story touched your heart, please hit like to support meaningful content like this. Share the video with the people you love, because sometimes a story can change the way someone sees life. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next moving stories. Ethan charged toward them like a madman, his feet seeming not to touch the ground, his heart hammering inside his chest. Behind him, Raymond and two bodyguards immediately drew their guns, the dark muzzles aimed straight at the homeless girl holding Margaret. Over the wind's furious howl, Raymond shouted, ordering the girl to let the older woman go and step back. But the girl didn't move at all. She looked straight into the gun barrels and said calmly, "If you shoot me, she falls. And on this frozen sidewalk, she'll be dead before your ambulance even arrives." Ethan raised a hand, signaling the guards to lower their weapons. He dropped to his knees beside his mother, his hands shaking as they touched her pale face. Margaret stared at him with bewildered eyes, without the slightest spark of recognition, her lips still murmuring Richard's name. "Richard, why aren't you coming to pick me up?" Ethan felt as if someone were squeezing the life out of his heart. Richard was his father's name, the man who had been under 6 feet of earth for 10 years now. Raymond hurried to explain, his voice thick with regret and fear. The driver was highly trained, but Margaret had been in a state of perfect clarity all morning, leading everyone to lower their guard before she suffered a sudden, violent episode of disorientation at the red light. When the car stopped at a red light at a nearby intersection, Margaret suddenly opened the door and ran out. The driver panicked and chased after her, but she disappeared into the crowd. They had searched for 2 hours in the blizzard without finding a single trace. Ethan ground his teeth, rage surging in his chest, but he forced it down. This wasn't the time to unleash it. He turned to look at the homeless girl, who was still holding his mother tight, as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. He asked where she had found his mother, and how. The girl answered in a voice gone rough from the cold, her purpled lips trembling with every word. She said that a little more than an hour ago, she had been sheltering in the alley behind the restaurant when she heard crying. She followed the sound and found the old woman huddled beside a trash can, sobbing and calling for Richard. The woman kept saying she wanted to go home, that Richard was waiting for her, that she didn't know where she was. The girl said she recognized immediately that the woman was disoriented, possibly Alzheimer's or some other form of dementia. She had tried to ask for an address, a family phone number, but the woman couldn't remember anything at all. Ethan noticed the way the girl spoke, the medical terms she used as naturally as breathing, the way she described his mother's symptoms with the precision of someone trained. He asked why she hadn't called the police or an ambulance. The girl gave a sad smile, a withered little curve on lips cracked raw by the cold. She said she didn't have a phone, and even if she did, no one would believe a homeless girl holding an old woman in an expensive cashmere coat. They'd think she was robbing her, or running a scam. So there was only one thing she could do: stay with her, keep her warm, and wait. She had covered the woman with her only blanket, using her own body as a shield against the wind. She talked to her about Richard, about the memories the older woman spilled out in her panic, trying to keep her calm and alert. Margaret had stopped crying now, her head resting on the girl's shoulder, her eyes shut as if sinking into a peaceful sleep. Ethan watched that scene, and something strange rose in his chest. The girl was freezing to death, her lips dark with cold, her arms and legs shaking uncontrollably. Yet she was still here, still holding a complete stranger, refusing to step away even once. In the distance, the wail of an ambulance siren tore through the icy night. But Ethan couldn't take his eyes off the homeless girl in front of him, the one who had just done what no one in his empire would dare to do, lay her own life down for a stranger and ask for nothing in return. The ambulance pulled up beside the curb, its brakes screeching against the ice-slick street. 2 paramedics jumped out and moved fast, lifting Margaret onto a stretcher and wheeling her into the vehicle. Ethan climbed in after them, but before the doors swung shut, he turned his head and looked back at the homeless girl still standing there, trembling in the blizzard, her arms wrapped tight around her own body as if she were trying to hold on to the last scraps of warmth. He pulled out his wallet, took every bit of cash inside, a thick stack, about $5,000, and stepped back down. He walked toward her and pressed the money into her hand. His voice clipped, saying it was a thank you for saving his mother, that she deserved to take it. The girl looked down at the stack in her hand, crisp $100 bills, probably more money than she'd seen in all 3 years of living on the streets. Then she lifted her head and met Ethan's eyes with a strange expression. Not contempt, not anger, but something almost like pity. She gently placed the money back into his hand and said she hadn't saved the woman for money, that anyone with a heart would have done the same. Ethan stood frozen where he was, unable to believe what had just happened. 15 years in the underworld had taught him that money could buy anything: loyalty, silence, even a human life. Never, not once in his life, had anyone refused his money. He asked her what she wanted, said he could give her anything she needed: a hot meal, a place to sleep for the night, a job, anything at all. The girl smiled, tired but sincere, and shook her head. She said she didn't want anything, that she had only done what her conscience told her to do, and that it didn't have a price. Then she bent down and picked up the old blanket lying on the sidewalk, soaked from melting snow, filthy and torn, but the only possession she had in this world. She wrapped it around herself and started to walk away. Her back turned to Ethan, her thin frame unsteady in the bitter wind. Ethan watched her go, and a strange feeling surged up in his chest, as if someone had driven a hard fist into his stomach. He called after her, his voice cutting through the screaming wind, asking what her name was. The girl stopped, but she didn't turn around. She answered in a hoarse voice from the cold, 2 short words echoing back into the frozen night. Autumn. Autumn Reed. Then she kept walking, her small figure fading into the white curtain of snow as if she'd never existed at all. Ethan stayed there a long time, still holding the $5,000 no one wanted. In his mind, a question kept ringing out. For the first time in many years, he asked himself, when was the last time I did something without any benefit to myself? He couldn't find an answer. The urgent wail of the ambulance behind him dragged him back to reality. He turned and climbed into the vehicle, but his eyes were still fixed on the dark alley where the girl had disappeared, and the name Autumn Reed kept echoing in his mind like a curse. The private Presbyterian hospital sat on the Upper East Side, a place reserved for the richest people in New York, where a single night in a hospital bed cost as much as a normal person's rent for an entire year. Ethan sat in the VIP waiting room, his eyes fixed on nothing, the $5,000 still in his coat pocket like a reminder of the strange girl in the blizzard. The exam room door opened, and Dr. Helen Park stepped out with a grave expression, a medical file clutched tight in her hand. She'd been the Blackwood family's private physician for 20 years, the only person who understood Margaret's condition better than Ethan himself ever had. She invited him into a private office and closed the door behind them, her voice dropping as she began to explain the test results. Early-stage Alzheimer's. The words fell like a sledgehammer, crushing a hope Ethan hadn't even realized he'd been holding. Dr. Park explained that Margaret would have days of complete clarity, when she remembered everything and everyone, but she'd also have days of confusion, when she didn't know who she was, where she was, or who the people around her were. The disease would progress with time, the clear days growing fewer, the confused days growing more. There was no cure, only ways to slow it down. And most importantly, Margaret couldn't live alone anymore. Ethan sat there, his back rigid as stone, his face showing nothing. But inside, he felt as if someone were tearing his chest apart piece by piece. $200 million. He could buy an entire skyscraper. He could buy anyone's silence. He could buy a human life if he had to. But he couldn't buy his mother's memory back. He couldn't buy back the years already gone, the moments she would forget, the memories that would fade like snow melting under the sun. He remembered the years before, when he was still a boy, when the Blackwood Empire hadn't belonged to him yet. Margaret was the only person in the world who called him her little son. Not boss, not Mr. Blackwood, not any title soaked in power that made all of New York tremble. Just her little son, in a gentle voice, with eyes full of love. She was the only one who dared to scold him when he didn't eat his vegetables, dared to worry when he didn't sleep enough, dared to knock on a meeting room door full of cold-blooded killers just to remind him to take his vitamins. And she was the only one who never asked about his work. She didn't ask why there was blood on his sleeve. She didn't ask why he came home at 3 o'clock in the morning with eyes like ice. She asked only one question, every time she saw him, in that worried voice and that tender gaze. "Are you happy?" Ethan had never answered honestly. He always said yes, always said everything was fine, always told her not to worry. But she knew, she always knew, and she never stopped asking. His father, Richard Blackwood, had been under 6 feet of earth for 10 years, killed by a bullet from an enemy Ethan later avenged in the most brutal way. Margaret was the only family he had left, the only thread that still tied him to the humanity he'd thought had died long ago. And now this vicious illness would slowly steal her from him, little by little, one shard of memory at a time, until she looked at him the way she'd look at a stranger. Ethan stood up and walked out of the office with a face as cold as stone. He ordered Raymond to prepare everything: the best nurses, security around the clock, the most advanced medical equipment. Money didn't matter. But when he stood at his mother's bedside and watched her sleeping peacefully, unaware of the sentence the doctor had just spoken, he felt smaller and more powerless than he ever had in his life. 3 days had passed since that fateful blizzard night. Ethan spent most of his time putting everything in place for his mother, hiring a nursing team to care for her 24 hours a day, tightening security around the mansion in Greenwich, installing the most advanced medical monitoring system money could buy. He fired the new driver and replaced him with someone who'd worked for the family for more than 10 years. He checked every smallest detail, from the medications Margaret took each day to her regular examination schedule. But in between meetings, calls, and decisions he made with the cold precision of a Mafia boss, one image kept returning to his mind like a ghost that refused to leave. Lips turned purple from the cold, a thin body shaking in the wind, clear blue eyes staring straight into a gun barrel without a shred of fear. A worn, soaking wet blanket wrapped around her like the only treasure she had. And that sentence, that hoarse voice, kept echoing in his head. "I didn't save her for money. Anyone with a heart would do the same." Ethan sat in his office at the Upper East Side penthouse, looking out through the wide glass windows covered in white snow. He wondered where the girl was now, whether she was still alive in this 15 below cold, whether she was still wrapped in that torn blanket, curled up in some dark alley somewhere. And then a painful thought cut through his mind like a knife. That homeless girl, who had nothing but an old blanket, had done more for his mother than he had done in months. She'd sat with Margaret for more than an hour in a blizzard, keeping her warm, talking to her, calming her down, while he, with $200 million in his accounts, saw his mother only once a week at Friday dinner, and sometimes even made excuses about work to avoid it. He came out of obligation, and she came out of heart. He gave money, and she gave something more valuable than money: her presence, her care, simple human kindness. Ethan picked up the phone and called Raymond. His voice was cold and decisive as always, but the order he gave made the man who'd been loyal for 15 years fall silent for a long moment. "Find Autumn Reed, at any cost." Raymond asked again, just to be sure he hadn't misheard, then confirmed he'd do it immediately. But before he hung up, he couldn't hold back his curiosity. In 15 years of following Ethan Blackwood, Raymond had never seen his boss care about anyone outside his family. Not once. And yet now, Ethan was ordering him to find a homeless girl with no fame, no address, nothing at all but a torn blanket. Raymond didn't ask anything else. He knew his limits. But when he ended the call, he knew something had changed inside Ethan Blackwood. Something even Ethan himself hadn't noticed yet. The first day and the second day of the search brought nothing. Raymond mobilized the entire underground information network of the Blackwood Empire, the best hackers, the most expensive private investigators, the contacts inside the police department, but everything came back as 0. Autumn Reed was like a ghost. No record in any database, no identification papers, no registered address, no bank account, no phone number, no trace proving she'd ever existed in this world. She'd vanished from the system 3 years ago, as if she'd never been born. By the 3rd day, Ethan ran out of patience. He decided to look for her himself, a decision Raymond protested fiercely for security reasons, but Ethan didn't bother listening. He wore a plain black coat instead of the expensive Brioni suits he wore every day. But no matter how hard he tried to blend in, he still stood out like a shark among sardines. He walked through the alleys of Lower Manhattan, places he'd never set foot in throughout all 36 years of his life, and for the first time, he saw New York from a completely different angle. Trash piled up beside overflowing dumpsters. The stench of sewer water and rotten food rose thick in the air. Soggy cardboard sheets served as beds, plastic bags as blankets, and eyes, dozens of eyes, empty and lifeless as they watched him pass. Not curious, not afraid, not hopeful, only hollow, as if the soul had left the body long ago. Ethan felt nauseated, not from the smell, but from realizing he'd lived in this city his whole life, without ever knowing this world existed. Only a few miles from his luxurious penthouse. Behind him, 2 bodyguards followed in silence at just the right distance. A glossy black Maybach waited a few blocks away, standing by like a reminder of the abyss between 2 worlds. On the 4th day, he finally found her. In an alley behind an Italian restaurant in Hell's Kitchen, among trash cans and the sour stink of spoiled tomato sauce, Ethan saw a familiar shape. Autumn was crouched on the frozen ground, and in front of her sat another homeless old woman, her white hair matted and wild, her clothes torn and even more pitiful than Autumn's. Autumn was dividing up leftovers she'd just pulled from the restaurant's trash. Hard pieces of bread, a few chunks of ice-cold pasta, a little wilted vegetable. Ethan watched from a distance, and what he saw made his chest feel like someone was squeezing it shut. She gave most of the food to the old woman, keeping for herself only a small piece of bread and a few strands of noodles. She ate slowly, one small bite at a time, as if she were trying to stretch that meager meal for as long as possible. Every so often she coughed, deep, aching coughs that rumbled in her chest, the aftermath of that blizzard night when she'd sat for more than an hour in 15 below cold, and wrapped around her shoulders was still that same old blanket, dirtier and more tattered than before, yet she held on to it like a treasure. Ethan drew a long breath, and then he stepped into the alley. Autumn lifted her head at the sound of footsteps, and her clear blue eyes met Ethan's gaze. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look afraid. She just watched him with a calm expression, as if she'd known all along he'd come. She rose slowly, pulling the old blanket tighter around her shoulders, then asked in a voice made rough by coughing whether the old lady from that night was all right. Ethan stopped a few steps away from her, startled that the first thing she asked wasn't about herself, wasn't why he was here, but about Margaret, the woman she'd met only once, in the middle of a blizzard. He said his mother was physically fine, but the doctors had diagnosed her with early-stage Alzheimer's. Autumn went quiet for a long time, and her eyes darkened suddenly, like a sky before a storm. Then, she said, softly as breath, "My mother didn't recognize me in her final days either." The sentence hung in the freezing air, heavy and painful. Ethan wanted to ask more, but he held back. Instead, he asked why she'd refused his money that night. Autumn looked at him, a sad smile flickering across her cracked lips, and she said, "Money can buy food, but it can't buy a reason to eat." That she'd once had money, a lot of money, but it didn't save her family. Ethan stood there, waiting, and as if she were too tired to keep holding secrets, Autumn began to tell him. She'd once been a final-year medical student at Columbia University, ranked in the top 3 of her class, with a bright future stretched out in front of her. Her father, David Reed, was a renowned surgeon in New York, a principled man who was respected. Her mother, Sarah Reed, was a nurse, who'd met her father at the hospital and loved him from the first glance. They were a happy family, with everything people dreamed of: money, status, love. And then Brandon Mercer appeared. She met him at a hospital charity event, a charming young businessman with an irresistible smile and sweet words. He pursued her like the perfect gentleman, bringing flowers, giving gifts, saying the things she wanted to hear. She loved him blindly, trusted him completely. She didn't know that behind the polished surface, Brandon Mercer was the son of a Mafia boss, and he'd come close to her only to exploit her father's connections in elite medical circles for money laundering. When David Reed discovered the truth and refused to cooperate, Brandon struck back, an electrical fault fire. That was the police conclusion. Both her father and mother burned to death in the house she'd grown up in, while she was in her school dorm. Brandon vanished as if he'd never existed. Every piece of evidence destroyed, every trace erased. She knew what he'd done, but she had no way to prove it. Autumn paused, drew a deep breath, and another coughing fit hit, forcing her to bend over. When it passed, she continued in an empty voice. She said that year she was 24, alone in the face of both her parents' deaths, the betrayal of the man she loved, and the truth that she'd unknowingly let a killer into her home. The shock was too much and drove her into severe depression. She dropped out, lost her part-time job, then lost the apartment she rented. 3 years on the streets taught her how to survive without money, without an identity, without anything except a torn blanket and the will to get through each day. Ethan asked why she hadn't tried to take revenge, with everything Brandon had done. Autumn looked at him with that strange expression, sad and calm at the same time. And she said revenge doesn't bring her parents back, that she'd lost enough already, and she didn't want to lose herself too in a spiral of hatred. And in the very moment she said the name Brandon Mercer, Ethan felt as if someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over his head. He knew that name well. But what Autumn didn't know was that the moment she said the name Brandon Mercer, Ethan's eyes changed completely, because the man who'd destroyed her life was the very enemy Ethan had been hunting for 5 years. Brandon Mercer, the son of Victor Mercer, the boss at the head of the rival Mafia empire opposing the Blackwood family. It was Victor Mercer who'd ordered the assassination of Ethan's father 10 years ago, and Brandon was the heir who was slowly taking control of that empire. Ethan had spent 5 years gathering evidence, tracking every move the Mercer family made, waiting for the right moment to take revenge. And now, standing in front of him, was a homeless girl who was also a victim of that same enemy. Fate was cruelly ironic. Ethan kept his face blank, revealing nothing of the thoughts surging through his mind. He didn't tell Autumn the truth. Not yet. Not now. Instead, he drew a deep breath and made an offer. He said he wanted her to come work for him, to take care of Margaret. A full-time job, high pay, a place to live at the family estate in Greenwich, full medical insurance, and anything else she needed. Autumn stared at him as if he'd grown another head. Then she shook her head, her voice suddenly firm. She said she didn't want to live off anyone's pity, that she'd survived 3 years on the streets without needing handouts, and she didn't intend to start now. Ethan didn't lose heart. He'd expected her to refuse. This girl had more pride than anyone he'd ever met. He said this was work, not charity, that he was hiring her as an employee, not rescuing a beggar. His mother needed care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He'd hired dozens of professional nurses, people who'd graduated from the finest schools, people with degrees and experience stacked high. But Margaret didn't like them. She felt like they were strangers, and she was afraid around them. She refused to eat and screamed whenever they came near. But on that blizzard night, when she was panicked and lost, Autumn was the only person who'd made her calm down. She talked to her, kept her warm, made her feel safe. That wasn't pity, it was ability. Something no amount of money could buy. Autumn fell silent, her eyes dropping to the ground, her thin fingers gripping the old blanket tight. She was thinking, weighing it, fighting with herself. Finally, she lifted her head and said she had one condition. She wanted to do real work, not be a puppet he could display to show off kindness in front of the world. She would care for Margaret like a professional caregiver, not like a decoration or a charity project he could brag about to the upper class. If he wanted an obedient puppet, he should find someone else. Ethan looked at her, a thin girl with stubborn eyes and a proud chin lifted high in spite of everything. He nodded and said he agreed, that she would be his mother's caregiver, with full authority and responsibility, not anyone's puppet. She could start whenever she was ready. Autumn studied him for a moment longer, as if she were trying to read the thoughts behind those cold eyes. Then she nodded, short, decisive. She said she was ready right now, because she had nothing to bring with her except this blanket. Ethan signaled to Raymond, who was waiting at the mouth of the alley, and for the first time in days, he felt like he'd just made the right decision. A week had passed since Autumn first stepped into the Greenwich mansion. While she was slowly adjusting to her new life, and Margaret was growing more and more attached to her, Ethan was quietly carrying out a private investigation. He ordered Raymond to dig deep into Brandon Mercer's past, to learn everything connected to the fire 3 years ago and the link between him and Autumn Reed. What Raymond brought back made Ethan clamp his teeth so hard he had to fight to keep his anger contained. Brandon Mercer hadn't just known Autumn was still alive. He'd had people watching her for the past 3 years. Mercer's spies had recorded her every step on the streets, every alley where she slept through the night, every dumpster she searched for food. Brandon wanted to make sure she was completely crushed, that she no longer had the strength or the will to accuse him, that she would rot and die on the streets like a nameless nobody. He'd been playing a cruel game, watching the girl who'd once loved him slowly wither day by day as a kind of psychological torture. And now Autumn had suddenly vanished from the streets. Brandon's trackers had reported that she hadn't shown up at any of her usual spots for a full week. That meant Brandon would start searching, and with the Mercer Empire's information network, finding where Autumn was would only be a matter of time. Ethan sat in his office at the penthouse, staring at the thick file in front of him. Everything was becoming more complicated than he'd imagined. Brandon Mercer wasn't just his enemy in the underworld, the heir to the empire that had killed his father. He was also the man who'd ruined the life of the girl now living under Ethan's roof, caring for his mother, slowly becoming part of a life Ethan never expected. 2 worlds were colliding, and Autumn was standing right at the center of the storm without even knowing it. Ethan could tell her the truth, that he knew who Brandon was, that he was a victim of the Mercer family too, that she was being protected by a Mafia boss, but he didn't do it. She'd only just begun to find peace, only just begun to sleep well after 3 years of living in fear. He didn't want to drag her back into the pit of nightmares. Instead, Ethan called Raymond and gave a series of orders. Double the number of guards around the Greenwich estate. Install more security cameras on every corner. Post men 24 hours a day at the main gate and the side gate. Thoroughly vet the background of every employee in the house. Not a single fly was to get in without his permission. Raymond asked whether he should warn Autumn about the potential danger. Ethan shook his head. She didn't need to know. Not yet. He would protect her from the shadows, the way he'd always done everything, quietly and brutally if he had to. The Greenwich mansion was vast and magnificent, grander than anywhere Autumn had ever lived, even her parents' home in the past. The room they gave her was on the 2nd floor, right next to Margaret's, with a window overlooking a garden blanketed in white snow. There was a king-size bed dressed in Egyptian silk sheets, a closet as wide as the alley where she'd once slept, a private bathroom with a marble tub and gold-plated shower fixtures. For the first time in 3 years, she had a room of her own, a real bed, a roof over her head. But on the first night, Autumn couldn't sleep. She lay on that soft bed, staring up at the soaring ceiling, and felt as if she were sinking. The mattress was too soft, the sheets too smooth, the room too quiet. 3 years on the streets had trained her body to hard ground, to the city's noise, to cold that cut through skin and bone. This comfort felt unfamiliar, wrong, as if she didn't deserve to be here. She tossed and turned until near midnight, and then she couldn't take it anymore. She sat up, opened the closet, and pulled out the old blanket she'd carried from the streets, the filthy, tattered blanket the butler had wanted to throw away but she'd insisted on keeping. She spread it on the floor right beside the window, then lay down and curled into herself the way she had in dark alleys at night. The wooden floor was hard and icy cold, but it felt strangely familiar. And then the tears started to fall. She cried not because she was sad, not because she missed the brutal days on the streets. She cried because she wasn't used to being treated like a human being, because it had been so long since anyone had looked at her as a normal person, instead of a pitiful homeless woman, because over the past 3 years she'd forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. In the days that followed, Autumn slowly adapted to her new life. She began her work caring for Margaret, and thankfully, the first days were days of clarity for her. Margaret welcomed her with open arms, as if they'd known each other for a long time. She remembered her as the girl from the blizzard night, the one who'd kept her warm when she'd been lost, and she called Autumn her angel. The two of them sat for hours in the warm living room, talking about all kinds of things. Margaret was curious about Autumn's past, about how she'd once studied medicine, and she said Richard, her husband, had also wanted to become a doctor, before his family forced him to take over the business. She talked about Richard with sparkling eyes and a happy smile, about the days when they'd first fallen in love, about how he'd proposed under the rain in Central Park, about a life together full of storms, but never lacking love. Autumn listened with real empathy, because she understood what it meant to lose the people you loved. She understood the pain of living in a world where memory was the only thing left. In the days after that, Autumn began researching Alzheimer's on her own, reading every medical source she could find, studying the most effective caregiving methods. She made a family photo album for Margaret, collecting pictures from all over the house, writing down each person's name and relationship beneath every photo to help Margaret remember on disoriented days. And every night, before Margaret slipped into sleep, Autumn sang her a lullaby her mother had sung to her when she was small. Her voice wasn't beautiful, but Margaret always smiled and closed her eyes, her wrinkled hand holding tight to Autumn's as if she were afraid Autumn would disappear. 2 months passed, and something was changing in Ethan Blackwood that even he didn't recognize. Before, he only came back to the Greenwich mansion once a week on Friday night, ate dinner with his mother, then returned to Manhattan the next morning. But now he came more often, sometimes in the middle of the week, sometimes on evenings with no particular reason at all. He told Raymond he wanted to check on his mother's health, that he was worried about Alzheimer's progressing, but deep down, he knew that was only an excuse. Every time he came home, he found a way to talk to Autumn. Sometimes it was short questions about Margaret's condition. Sometimes it was long conversations that lasted for hours on the porch after Margaret had gone to sleep. Autumn wasn't like anyone Ethan had ever met. She didn't fear him the way the people under him did. She didn't flatter him like those trying to use his power. She didn't judge him like people who knew what his work really was. She simply treated him like an ordinary human being, asking whether he'd eaten dinner instead of asking how business was, offering him a cup of hot tea instead of a glass of expensive whiskey, and she asked questions no one dared to ask him. One night, as they sat on the porch looking out at the pitch-black garden, Autumn suddenly turned to him and asked whether he ever felt lonely. Ethan went quiet for a long moment, the question slicing straight through the armor he'd built over 15 years. No one asked him that, not ever. People assumed a Mafia boss with $200 million in his accounts couldn't be lonely, that power and money were all a man needed. But Autumn asked, and she asked with those clear blue eyes that held no nosy curiosity, only genuine care. He said yes, that he was lonely almost all the time, that he could walk into a room full of people and still feel like he was standing alone in the middle of a desert. Autumn nodded as if she understood completely, then said she was the same, that 3 years on the streets had taught her the scariest loneliness wasn't having no one around. It was having millions of people around and still no one truly seeing you. On a rainy night at the end of the month, Ethan came home later than usual. Margaret was asleep, the house wrapped in silence, but he saw Autumn sitting alone on the porch under the overhang, watching the rain fall. He stepped outside, and she turned with a small smile. She said that when she lived on the streets, she hated rain more than anything, because rain meant wet and cold, meant long nights without sleep in alleys that turned into rivers. But now she could sit here and watch the rain without being afraid of getting soaked, without being afraid of the cold, and she realized how beautiful rain actually was when it wasn't your enemy. Ethan didn't say anything. He just sat down in the chair beside her, and they watched the rain in silence. The sound of rain on the porch roof, the wind moving through the trees, the steady breathing of the young woman beside him. And for the first time in many years, Ethan Blackwood felt peaceful. Not the false peace of drinking whiskey alone in a penthouse. Not the brief peace that came after destroying an enemy. This was real peace, deep and quiet, as if he'd finally found where he belonged after a long, exhausting journey. The next morning at breakfast, Margaret looked at her son with shining eyes and said he was smiling more, that she liked him this way. Ethan didn't know what to say, because he hadn't realized he'd been smiling until his mother pointed it out. That fragile peace didn't last long. One morning at the start of the week, Raymond called Ethan in a tone of tension he almost never used. A black sedan had been parked on the road leading to the Greenwich estate for 3 days now, always keeping just enough distance not to draw attention, but close enough to watch everything coming and going from the house. Ethan's guards had tracked the vehicle and identified the license plate. It belonged to one of the Mercer family's front companies. Ethan immediately ordered the driver seized and taken to a secret warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The interrogation lasted all night, and what Ethan pulled from him made his blood boil. Brandon Mercer didn't just know Autumn was here. He knew what she was doing, how she was living, even her daily schedule. He was planning something the driver didn't know in detail, but enough for Ethan to understand that Brandon had no intention of letting Autumn live in peace. On the drive back to Greenwich, Ethan wrestled with himself. Should he tell Autumn the truth? Tell her that the man who'd killed her parents was watching her, that she'd never truly been safe, that the man whose house she was living in was also a mafia boss, no different from Brandon. But then he thought of her eyes as she watched the rain, of her smile as she sang Margaret to sleep, of the way she'd finally been able to sleep in a bed instead of curled on the floor. She'd only just begun to come back to life after 3 years of hell, only just begun to believe the world wasn't made of darkness alone. He couldn't bring himself to drag her back into the pit of fear and despair. He chose silence. He would strengthen security, watch Brandon's every move, be ready to strike if it became necessary. But Autumn didn't need to know. Shouldn't know. At least not yet. That night, Ethan sat in the study at the mansion, staring at the file on the Mercer family without really reading a word. His mind was a tangled mess, his nerves stretched tight as a string about to snap. He didn't hear the soft footsteps in the hallway until the door eased open, and Autumn walked in with a cup of hot tea in her hand. She didn't ask what he was doing. She didn't ask why he looked so exhausted. She didn't ask anything at all. She only set the tea down on his desk, then took the chair across from him, silent. Ethan looked at her, the girl with brown hair falling loose over her shoulders, with gentle blue eyes that held not the slightest invasive curiosity. She didn't demand an explanation, didn't force him to share. She was simply there, beside him, a quiet reminder that he wasn't alone. And Ethan realized that this girl, who didn't know he was shielding her from the worst nightmare of her life, was giving him something he hadn't known he needed so badly. Simple presence, without conditions, without demands. He swore to himself that he would do everything, anything, to make sure she never had to be afraid again. 2 weeks after the interrogation of the spy, Ethan received an invitation to the annual charity gala of Manhattan's upper class at the Plaza Hotel. It was the kind of event he couldn't refuse. A place where underground deals were made under the cover of champagne flutes and polished social smiles. He didn't want to go, didn't want to leave the Greenwich estate while the threat from Brandon still hung in the air. But his absence would raise unnecessary suspicion, and he decided to bring Autumn with him on the pretext that she needed to shop for some medical supplies for Margaret in Manhattan. In truth, he only wanted her within his sight, where he could protect her if anything happened. Autumn wore a simple black dress one of the household staff had found for her, her hair pinned up neatly, looking like an assistant more than a woman who'd spent 3 years on the streets. She sat in the hotel's waiting area while Ethan attended the gala upstairs, scrolling on her phone and reading medical articles about Alzheimer's that she'd downloaded. She didn't notice the familiar figure moving toward her until a voice sounded right by her ear, a voice she'd thought she'd buried in nightmares for 3 years. "Autumn Reed, look at you playing dress-up. I've enjoyed watching you rot in those alleys for 3 years, but it seems you've found a new master to crawl to." She looked up, and her heart seemed to stop. Brandon Mercer stood there in an expensive gray suit, wearing the charming smile she'd once loved to madness, the smile that now made her want to vomit. He looked unchanged, still handsome, still confident, still radiating danger hidden beneath a glossy surface. Autumn sprang to her feet, her legs shaking, her face as pale as paper. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything other than stand here and face the man who'd killed her parents. But her body wouldn't obey, rooted in place as if bewitched. Brandon stepped closer, too close, his breath brushing her ear as he whispered in a voice as cold as ice. "Autumn Reed, you look so comfortable in your new cage. I've watched you hiding in that Greenwich estate for months, but did you really think I'd let you stay there forever?" He gave a mocking laugh and went on, saying she was nothing. Autumn, just prey. A toy he hadn't grown bored of yet. And whenever he wanted, he'd come and take her back. Tears spilled from Autumn's eyes, her whole body trembling as memories of the fire crashed over her like a tidal wave and swallowed her whole. And at that exact moment, a strong hand clamped around her arm and yanked her away from Brandon. Ethan stood there, his face cold as stone, his eyes on Brandon with a look Autumn had never seen in him before, the look of a killer, of a true mafia boss, ruthless and thick with lethal intent. He didn't say a word. He only pulled Autumn toward the exit, but before they vanished from sight, Ethan turned his head and looked back at Brandon one more time. The two men's eyes met, and in that brief instant, a silent declaration of war was delivered. The Maybach tore through the night, Ethan in the back seat with Autumn folded into the corner, her whole body shaking without stopping. She wasn't sobbing out loud, but tears streamed down her cheeks, her eyes wide and fixed on empty space, as if she were seeing the worst nightmare of her life all over again. When they reached the Greenwich mansion, Ethan brought her into the living room and signaled for all the staff to leave. Margaret was sleeping soundly, the house submerged in silence, with only Autumn's ragged breathing and the soft crackle of fire in the fireplace. And then she completely fell apart. She sank down onto the floor, hugged her knees, and began to cry. Broken sobs bursting up from deep in her chest, as if she'd been holding them back for 3 years. Ethan stood there for a moment, not knowing what to do. He was a mafia boss. He knew how to kill, how to torture, how to make enemies tremble. But he didn't know how to comfort a girl who was crying. Then instinct overcame awkwardness. He sat down beside her, and for the first time in his life, he held a woman who wasn't his mother. He pulled her into his arms, let her cry into his shoulder, his hand clumsily patting her back the way he'd once seen his mother do when he was a boy. Autumn cried for a long time, until there were no tears left to cry. Then she began to speak, her voice hoarse and broken. She told him about the nightmares that had haunted her for 3 years, dreams where she saw the house burning, saw her parents calling her name inside a sea of flames, saw Brandon standing far away, smiling as he watched. She told him about the constant fear that one day he would find her and finish what he'd started. She said she'd thought she was safe here, that she'd started to believe she could forget the past, but he'd found her. He always found her. Ethan listened, and when she finished, he knew it was time to tell the truth. He said he knew who Brandon Mercer was, that he'd known since the very first night she told her story in the Hell's Kitchen alley. Brandon was Victor Mercer's son, the lifelong enemy of the Blackwood family, the man who'd ordered Ethan's father killed 10 years ago. Ethan had been watching the Mercer family for years, collecting evidence of every crime they'd committed, including the fire that had taken her parents' lives. He said he could kill Brandon right now if she wanted. That one phone call would be enough, and the man who'd destroyed her life would vanish from this world before dawn. Autumn lifted her head to look at him, her eyes red from crying but lit with something hard to read. Ethan went on, his voice lowering, thick with resolve, telling her she only had to give him one order, one word, and he would do it. Autumn was silent for a long time. So long Ethan thought she hadn't heard him. Then she spoke, and her answer stunned him. No, Ethan frowned, confused. He said Brandon had killed her parents, ruined her life, turned her into a homeless woman on the streets for 3 years, and she didn't want revenge. Autumn looked at him with an endless sadness in her eyes, and asked whether killing him would bring her parents back, would erase the 3 years she'd lived in hell, would help her sleep any better. Then she shook her head, and said her justice wasn't Brandon's death. Her justice was living better, living happier, living a life that man couldn't touch. That was how she would take revenge, by proving he couldn't destroy her. Ethan sat there, staring at the girl in front of him, and for the first time in his life, he began to doubt the way he'd lived. For 15 years, he'd believed revenge was justice, that blood had to be paid with blood, that enemies had to be wiped out. But this girl, who'd lost more than he had, was choosing a different path, and he didn't know which of them was the one who was right. Ethan respected Autumn's decision, and he was wrong, because a week later, Brandon struck first, and this time, Ethan nearly lost her forever. That morning began like any other. Autumn took Margaret to the hospital for a routine checkup, an appointment on the schedule with Dr. Helen Park. A black SUV carried them, with a driver and a bodyguard in the front seat, safe enough by ordinary standards. But Brandon Mercer didn't play by ordinary rules. As the vehicle moved through a quiet intersection on the outskirts of Greenwich, a heavy truck suddenly slammed into the right side of the SUV at a terrifying speed. No horn, no warning, only the shriek of metal and the world spinning in a heartbeat. In that chaos, as the SUV tipped and glass exploded everywhere, Autumn had time to do only one thing. She threw herself over Margaret, using her entire body to shield her from the sharp shards and the brutal force of the impact. When everything finally stopped moving, Margaret was almost unharmed, aside from a few small scratches. But Autumn lay motionless, blood streaming from a wound on her head, her breathing so faint it was nearly impossible to see. Ethan got the call while he was in the middle of a meeting in Manhattan. He didn't say a word. He just stood up and ran out, leaving a dozen stunned faces staring after him. The Maybach flew toward the hospital like it was out of control, and the whole way there Ethan felt as if someone were crushing his heart in a fist. When he arrived, Autumn had already been taken into the emergency room. The doctor told him with a grave face that she had 3 broken ribs, a traumatic brain injury, and she was in a coma. They would do everything they could, but the next 24 hours would be critical. For the next 2 days, Ethan didn't leave Autumn's bedside for even a single step. He sat in the stiff chair beside her bed, holding her ice-cold hand in his eyes never leaving the pale face lying so still. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He didn't answer his phone. Raymond stood outside the room, watching his boss through the small glass window, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. In 15 years of following Ethan Blackwood, he'd never seen him like this. Unshaven, eyes red from lack of sleep and maybe from tears he'd never admit to. On the second day, Margaret came to visit. She was having a clear day, and when she saw her son sitting by Autumn's bed with that devastated look, she understood everything. She stepped into the room, set a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and asked in a gentle voice whether he loved her. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't know how to, because he'd never loved anyone but his mother, never let his heart belong to anyone else. But when he lifted his head to look at her, his eyes said everything his mouth couldn't. Margaret smiled, the knowing smile of a mother. Then she sat down beside him and took Autumn's other hand, and mother and son sat in silence and prayed for the girl lying between them, the girl who'd saved her twice and was now fighting on the line between life and death. On the morning of the third day, when the first sunlight slipped through the hospital curtain, Autumn's eyes fluttered open. She looked around the stark white room with a dazed expression. Then her gaze settled on Ethan sitting beside the bed, his hand still holding hers. And the first words she managed, hoarse and weak, weren't about herself, weren't about what had happened, but a question about whether Margaret was all right. Ethan felt his throat tighten, his eyes burning as he told her his mother was fine, that Autumn had saved her one more time. Autumn gave a faint smile, as if it were the best news she could have heard. Then she closed her eyes again and slipped into healing sleep. Ethan stayed there a long time, watching her peaceful face. Then he stood and walked out into the hallway where Raymond was waiting. His right hand reported in a low voice that they'd confirmed Brandon Mercer was behind the crash. The truck had been rented through a shell company tied to the Mercer empire. The driver was a criminal with a record who'd been paid a large sum to do it, and then disappear. All of Ethan's men were waiting for the order, waiting for the phone call that would ignite the bloody war they'd prepared for a long time. They had enough men, enough guns, enough power to erase the Mercer family from the map in a single night. Ethan stood by the hallway window, staring down at the parking lot below, and he thought, for 15 years, he'd solved every problem with violence. An enemy betrayed him. He killed them. A competitor challenged him. He removed them. Anyone who threatened his family disappeared without a trace. That was how the underworld worked. The law he'd been taught since he was a teenager, learning the trade at his father's side. But then he thought of Autumn, of the girl lying in the hospital room behind him with 3 broken ribs and a wound on her head. She had every reason to want Brandon dead, more than Ethan did. That man had killed her parents, ruined her life, turned her into a homeless woman, and now he'd nearly killed her again. But she'd chosen not to take revenge. She'd chosen to live instead of kill, chosen happiness instead of hate. She'd said that was her revenge, proving her enemy couldn't destroy her. And for the first time in his life, Ethan wanted to try doing it her way. He turned to Raymond and gave an order that made the loyal man's mouth fall open in shock. He told him to contact his lawyer and prepare every document, every piece of evidence they'd collected on the Mercer family over the years, the Reed House fire, the money laundering transactions, the illegal weapons trafficking ring, everything, then hand it all over to the FBI. Raymond asked again just to be sure he hadn't misheard, and Ethan nodded to confirm. He wanted Brandon Mercer and his entire empire to fall, but not by bullets and blood, by law, by courtrooms, by the way ordinary citizens handled things. 2 weeks later, the FBI raided the Mercer family's headquarters. Brandon was arrested along with his father and dozens of other men. The evidence Ethan provided was enough to put them in prison for the rest of their lives. And for the first time in history, a powerful Mafia empire collapsed, not because of a gang war, but because of a public trial with a jury and a judge. When the news broke on television, Autumn was sitting up in her hospital bed with Ethan beside her. She looked at him with eyes full of astonishment and emotion, and asked why he'd done it, why he hadn't killed Brandon the way his world always did. Ethan looked at her and said she'd asked him what he believed in, and he'd had no answer for many years, but now he did. He believed in her. The next 2 months were the most miraculous stretch of time the Greenwich mansion had ever witnessed. Autumn was discharged and came home to recover, and from the adopted daughter who cared for Margaret, She suddenly became the patient the whole household cared for. Margaret, on her clear days, insisted on cooking rice porridge for Autumn with her own hands, sitting by the bed and reading to her, and scolding Ethan if he didn't bring enough fresh fruit upstairs for her. She treated Autumn like her own daughter, and sometimes on disoriented days, she even called Autumn her daughter, the daughter she'd never had. Ethan changed too, in ways Raymond could hardly believe. He started working from home, something that had never happened in the 15 years he'd run the Blackwood empire. He held meetings by video call instead of going to the office, made decisions by phone instead of sitting in smoke-filled conference rooms. And every night, he was at the dinner table with his mother and Autumn, something he'd once done only once a week. Dinners for 3 became a sacred ritual none of them wanted to miss. One evening, Ethan announced he would cook dinner for the whole family himself. Margaret and Autumn exchanged skeptical looks, but no one stopped him. The result was a pot of pasta burned so badly, it was impossible to recognize what it had once been. Stir-fried vegetables turned to charcoal, and a sauce so salty it could have cured fish. Margaret looked at the plates in front of her and burst into laughter, bright and clear like a young girl, a laugh Ethan hadn't heard in a very long time. And Autumn, the girl who'd eaten leftovers from dumpsters for 3 years, calmly picked up her fork and ate every bite on her plate, then smiled and said it was the best meal she'd ever tasted. Ethan knew she was lying, but he also knew it was the sweetest lie he'd ever heard. In the weeks that followed, Autumn began teaching Ethan to play the piano. In the living room, there was a grand piano Richard had bought for Margaret years ago, but no one had touched it since he died. Autumn sat beside Ethan, patiently guiding each of his rough fingers onto the keys, and Margaret sat on the sofa with her eyes closed, listening, a happy smile blooming on her lips. They were peaceful moments, all 3 of them knew wouldn't last forever, and that was exactly why they treasured every second. One night, Ethan walked past Autumn's room and realized she was sleeping soundly in the bed, not on the floor the way she had in the first months. He paused in the doorway, watching the girl curled under warm blankets, her face peaceful, without a trace of worry. Then he saw the old blanket she'd carried from the streets, folded neatly and placed in the corner of her closet. She hadn't thrown it away. She kept it as a keepsake, as a reminder of the road she'd walked, of who she'd once been, and who she was becoming. At the same time, Ethan was making a transition of his own. He began the process of legitimizing the Blackwood empire, shifting from underground operations into lawful business. It was a painful, difficult process. Many of his old men didn't accept the change. They said Ethan had grown weak, that he'd lost a boss's instincts. Some left to join other crews. Some even threatened to expose Blackwood's secrets. But Ethan didn't waver. When Raymond asked why he'd chosen such a hard path, Ethan said he didn't want his mother to feel ashamed of him in her final clear days. Margaret had spent her whole life loving a man who lived in the shadows. First her husband, then her son. And now, as her memory slowly faded, Ethan wanted the clear moments she had left to be filled with pride, not shame. On a spring morning, when the first rays of sunlight slipped through the curtains and the cherry blossoms in the garden began to bloom, Margaret woke with eyes that were unusually clear. It was the clearest day she'd had in months, as if the vicious Alzheimer's had retreated for a moment to grant her one last precious window. She called for a staff member and asked that both Ethan and Autumn be brought to her room. When they entered, she was sitting up in bed, her back supported by soft pillows, her face peaceful, yet her gaze holding something deep and serious. She lifted a hand and motioned for them to sit on either side of the bed. Then she took both of their hands, her wrinkled fingers warm as they closed around the fingers of her son and the girl she thought of as a daughter. She spoke slowly and clearly, saying she knew her memory was slipping away, that soon she wouldn't recognize them anymore, wouldn't remember their names, wouldn't remember the moments they'd shared together. But before that happened, she wanted to say the things she'd carried in her heart for so many years. She turned to Ethan, her old eyes still bright with the boundless love of a mother. She said she'd loved him from the second he was born, from the moment she saw his tiny eyes open and look at the world for the first time. But for many years, she'd been afraid he would become a copy of his father, that he would live in darkness forever, that hatred and violence would swallow what remained of his humanity. She had watched her husband walk down that road and never come back, and she didn't want to watch her son follow the same tracks. But in these past months, she'd seen the change. She'd seen her true son again, the boy she thought she'd lost long ago. She'd seen him smile more, seen him care about other people, seen him choose the path of light instead of darkness, and she was proud. Proud not because of his power or his money, but because of his heart, because of the man he was truly becoming. Then she turned to Autumn and squeezed her hand tighter. She said Autumn had come into this family like an angel, appearing in the middle of a blizzard night when Margaret had been lost and terrified. Autumn had saved her life that night, but more importantly, she had saved Margaret's son from the darkness he'd lived in for so many years. Margaret didn't know how Autumn had done it, but she knew that since Autumn arrived, everything had changed. Ethan had changed. And in Margaret's heart, Autumn wasn't a servant, wasn't a caregiver. She was her daughter, the daughter she'd never had but had always wished for. She looked at both of them, her eyes filling with tears, and told them to stay together, to care for each other when she wasn't here anymore. They had saved each other in ways they might not even understand yet, and she wanted them to keep doing it, to keep being light for each other in the days ahead. The three of them held each other, tears streaming down all their faces, and no one said anything more, because words had become unnecessary in that sacred moment. When they finally let go, Margaret reached up to her neck and removed the necklace she'd worn for more than 40 years, the necklace that held her wedding ring with Richard's. She placed it in Autumn's hand and said she wanted Autumn to keep it, that the ring had witnessed her love with Richard for decades, and she wanted it to keep witnessing the love of the next generation. You will always be my daughter. No matter what happens, even if I forget everything, that will never change. Autumn closed her fingers around the ring, tears falling like rain, and she whispered 2 words she hadn't called anyone in 3 years. Mom. If this story touched your heart, please hit like to show your support. And the next part will make you believe that after darkness, light is always waiting. After that day, everything between Ethan and Autumn seemed to change in a subtle way that was hard to put into words. Their eyes lingered a little longer than they used to. Their fingers brushed by accident when one of them handed the other a morning cup of coffee. And there were quiet moments together where neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with speech. Ethan began finding reasons to be near her more often, and Autumn began smiling more every time she saw him appear. Margaret watched it all with the knowing eyes of a mother, and on her clear days she often found excuses to leave the two of them alone together. One late spring night, after Margaret had fallen asleep and the mansion was silent as a held breath, Ethan found Autumn sitting alone on the porch, gazing up at a sky crowded with stars. He sat down beside her, and they stayed quiet for a long time, letting the cool night wind brush their faces while the chirping of crickets laid a soft soundtrack under the rare peace. Then Ethan spoke, his voice low, edged with hesitation, and he said she knew he'd done terrible things, that his hands weren't clean, that he'd killed, that he'd ordered killings, that he'd done things an ordinary person would never forgive. Autumn turned to look at him, her blue eyes shining under the starlight, and she said she knew. Ethan stared at her, surprised and a little unsteady, then asked if she knew all of that. Why was she still here, still sitting beside him, still smiling at him every day as if he were a normal man? Autumn was quiet for a moment, as if weighing every word, and then she said gently, but with certainty, that she didn't love the man he used to be. She didn't love the cold Mafia boss with blood on his hands. She loved the man he was becoming, the man who sat by his mother's bed for 2 days and 2 nights, the man who learned to cook even if he burned the whole kitchen, the man who chose justice instead of revenge, the man who was trying, day by day, to become better. That was the man she loved. Ethan looked at her, and something in his eyes broke open, as if a wall he'd built for years finally collapsed. He lifted a hand and touched her cheek, and she didn't pull away. Then he leaned in and kissed her. A soft, gentle kiss, not feverish or rushed like in the movies, just lips meeting lips, 2 hearts finding each other after a long stretch of darkness. It was the kiss of 2 people who'd lost everything and found each other in a blizzard night, of 2 broken souls learning how to heal together. When they parted, Autumn smiled, and Ethan realized it was the most beautiful smile he'd ever seen in his life. 6 months after that first kiss, Alzheimer's began to accelerate, tearing through Margaret's memory without mercy. The clear days grew rare, then vanished entirely, replaced by days when she looked at Ethan like a stranger, days when she called for Richard and wept because she couldn't understand why her husband wouldn't come. She no longer remembered her son's name. She no longer remembered the mansion she'd lived in for decades. She no longer remembered anything about her life. But there was one strange thing neither Ethan nor the doctors could explain. Every time Autumn entered the room, Margaret calmed at once. She could be screaming in panic, crying without stopping, refusing to eat. But the moment Autumn took her hand and sang softly in that gentle voice, Margaret would go still and close her eyes like a peaceful child, as if her body remembered what her mind had forgotten, remembered that this girl was safety, that this girl was trust, that this girl was the daughter she had chosen. The last night came on a quiet autumn night, when yellow leaves covered the garden and a light wind moved through a half-open window. Ethan and Autumn sat on either side of Margaret's bed as they did every night, Ethan holding her left hand, Autumn holding her right. Margaret was asleep, her breathing even, her face serene as if she were having a beautiful dream. They sat there in silence, listening to her breathing, listening to their own hearts, neither of them willing to leave for even a second. And then, at around 3 a.m, Autumn noticed it first. Margaret's hand had gone cold. Her chest no longer rose and fell. Her breath had stopped without either of them realizing when. Margaret Blackwood was gone. In her sleep, peaceful and without pain, with the two people she loved most beside her. Autumn squeezed Ethan's hand and said his name in a trembling voice. Ethan looked down at his mother's face, and in that instant, he understood. He didn't cry right away. He didn't scream. He didn't smash things the way he usually reacted to loss. He just sat there, staring at the woman who had brought him into the world, who had loved him without condition for 36 years, and felt as if someone had carved a vast hollow straight through his chest. Then Autumn stood, walked around the bed, and wrapped her arms around him from behind. She didn't say anything. She only held him tight. And that was when Ethan Blackwood broke. He cried the way he'd never allowed himself to cry, cried like the motherless child he truly was. The Mafia boss who had made all of New York tremble, the man who had never shed a single tear in front of anyone, was now sobbing in the arms of the woman he loved, and he didn't care about image or reputation anymore. The funeral was held 3 days later, dignified but intimate, only the closest people present. And when it was time for the eulogy, it wasn't Ethan who stepped forward, it was Autumn. She spoke about the woman who had given her a family when she had no one left in the world, the woman who had called her daughter and had placed her most precious wedding ring into her hands. She spoke about unconditional love, about forgiveness, about the way Margaret had taught her that family wasn't blood. It was choice. Everyone cried, even the cold guards posted in the corners of the room. After the funeral, while sorting through Margaret's belongings, Ethan found a letter in the drawer of her vanity. It was written in trembling but clear handwriting, likely from one of her final clear days. She wrote that she knew she was going to forget everything soon, but she wanted her son to remember one thing: never let Autumn go, because she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, the light his mother had prayed for so many years. Ethan folded the letter, slipped it into his wallet, and carried it with him for the rest of his life. A year had passed since the day Margaret left, and the lives of both Ethan and Autumn had changed in ways no one could have imagined. Autumn decided to return to medical school and finish the doctor's degree she'd abandoned 3 years earlier. This time, she wasn't the young student, ambitious but naive, that she'd once been. She was a woman who'd walked through hell and come back, carrying scars and a deep understanding of human pain. She chose a specialty in Alzheimer's disease and healthcare for the homeless, 2 fields she'd lived through firsthand and understood better than anyone. When she received her diploma as the top student in her class, Ethan sat in the front row, applauding the loudest, tears sliding down his cheeks without him bothering to hide them. As for Ethan, he completed the transformation of the Blackwood empire from underground business into something fully legal. It was a journey filled with thorns and loss. More than half of his old men walked away, some because they couldn't accept the change, some because there was no longer a chance to make fast money the way they used to. There were those who turned their backs, even threatened to expose secrets, but Ethan faced it all with a calm he hadn't had before. He didn't regret any of it, because every time he looked in the mirror, he could meet his own eyes without seeing darkness anymore. Raymond was the only one who stayed from beginning to end, loyal not only to his boss, but to the new man his boss was becoming. Ethan and Autumn lived together at the Greenwich Mansion, the house that had held so many memories with Margaret now filled with laughter and light. They weren't only lovers. They were partners in life and in a mission to change the world in their own way. And that mission became real on the opening day of the Margaret Blackwood Center, a 5-story building in the heart of Manhattan, built on land Ethan had bought for tens of millions of dollars, with capacity for 100 beds for the homeless. But this wasn't an ordinary shelter. It offered free medical care, job training programs, mental health support, and most importantly, real employment opportunities for anyone who wanted to change their life. No handouts, no pity, only a chance for those ready to take it. Exactly the way Autumn had once said to Ethan in that Hell's Kitchen alley years ago. On opening day, the press swarmed in to cover the unusual story. The retired mafia boss and the homeless girl who became a doctor. The strange love between two worlds that should have never been able to meet. One reporter asked Ethan what had changed him, how a man like him could build a place like this. Ethan looked at Autumn standing beside him, then said, "Real success isn't measured by the money in your accounts or the enemies you've taken down. It's measured by how many people you help, how many lives you can change." Another reporter turned to Autumn and asked what message she wanted to send to the people still living on the streets the way she once had. Autumn smiled, her blue eyes shining, and she said with steady certainty that one chance is all you need to change your life, and you should never give up hope, because you don't know what tomorrow will bring. She was living proof of that. 1 year after the opening of the Margaret Blackwood Center, on that very same kind of blizzard night in December, Ethan and Autumn decided to walk through the old streets of Manhattan. Snow fell in a white blur, just like the fateful night years ago, the wind sharp enough to slice through skin. But this time, they didn't feel lonely or afraid. They walked together, hand in hand, past the alleys where Autumn had once slept, past the corners where she'd once dug through trash cans looking for food. But everything had changed. The alleys that used to be dark and dangerous now had awnings, heat lamps, and information signs for the Margaret Blackwood Center, with the address and a 24-hour hotline number. When they passed the alley behind the Italian restaurant in Hell's Kitchen, the place where Ethan had found Autumn for the first time, they stopped. In front of them was a sight so familiar it tightened the throat. A young girl, maybe only about 20, was sitting on the frozen ground, draping her own old blanket over an elderly homeless woman who was shaking from the cold. The girl's lips were purple, her arms and legs trembling, but she was still trying to use her body to block the wind for the older woman. Autumn squeezed Ethan's hand and whispered for him to look. History was repeating itself. Ethan watched the scene, then turned and asked Autumn if he should give the girl money. Autumn smiled, the smile Ethan had loved from the very first moment, and shook her head. She said no, he shouldn't give her money. He should give her a chance. They walked closer, and the young girl looked up with eyes that were wary and afraid. Eyes Autumn recognized instantly, because she'd once had the same eyes. Autumn crouched down to her level and spoke in a gentle voice, saying she knew how hard street life was, that she'd been here too, that she'd once covered a stranger with a blanket on a blizzard night, that she'd once believed she would die and no one would know. But she'd been wrong, because someone always cared. A chance always existed, as long as you were willing to take it. She invited the girl to the Margaret Blackwood Center, where there were warm beds, hot food, doctors, and people ready to help her start over from the beginning. The young girl looked at Autumn, then at Ethan, then back at Autumn, and suddenly broke down into sobs. She said this was the first time anyone had truly cared about her, the first time anyone had asked if she was all right, instead of walking past as if she were just trash on the sidewalk. Autumn pulled the girl into her arms, and in that moment, the circle closed in a perfect way. Ethan and Autumn's story began with an old blanket and one small act of kindness on a blizzard night. It changed both of their lives, turning a cold mafia boss into a man who could love, turning a desperate homeless girl into a doctor filled with hope. Margaret had been right when she said they had saved each other, and now they were saving other people together. This story teaches us that kindness is never meaningless, that one small act can change an entire life, that no one is truly hopeless if there is still someone willing to give them a chance. It reminds us that family isn't blood, it's choice, that love can bloom in the most unexpected places, and that every person can change if they're willing to open their heart. If you're watching this video and life feels too hard, remember that all it takes is one chance, one person who believes in you, and everything can change. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with the people you love, because sometimes a story can light hope for someone still living in the dark. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to hear more moving stories every day. We'd really love to know how you felt about this story. Whether it made you think of something in your own real life, please share with us in the comments below. We're always listening to every feeling that comes from deep in your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a happy life, and peace every day. Thank you for being with us. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.